I saved an injured alien werewolf girl now. She thinks I'm her mate. Welcome to the world of science fiction comment. Below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe, Caleb. Rains trudged through the knee-deep snow, his breath coming out in visible puffs, as the icy wind cut through the fabric of his jacket. His boots sank with each step, and the bitter cold gnawed at his fingers even through the insulated gloves. He was running out of time. His ship was totaled, his emergency beacon barely functional, and if he didn't find proper shelter soon, he'd be nothing more than a frozen corpse waiting to be picked apart by scavengers. The planet, officially labeled V029, was a death trap of perpetual winter, the kind of place smugglers and exiles disappeared into, never to be seen again. His mission had already gone to hell now. It was just about surviving long enough to figure out his next move. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, white and barren, broken only by the jagged remains of ancient rock formations jutting from the snow like the bones of some long-dead creature. Caleb tightened his scarf, scanning the horizon for anything resembling shelter. His instincts screamed at him that he wasn't alone, but out here he wasn't sure if that was paranoia or the very real presence of something watching him from the shadows. It was when he spotted the trail of dark crimson staining the snow ahead that he knew he'd found something or someone. Cautiously, he followed the blood, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his pulse pistol, though he doubted it had enough charge left to do any real damage. The trail led him to the mouth of a half-buried cave, the entrance hidden beneath thick layers of ice and rock. Inside, the air was warmer, the howling wind muffled, and deeper within he found the source of the blood. She was slumped against the cave wall, her breathing shallow, thick white fur matted with blood that gleamed dark under the dim light filtering in from outside. Caleb's first thought was that she was some kind of beast, but the moment his gaze met hers, he knew better. Sapphire eyes filled with pain and exhaustion locked onto him, but there was no mistaking the intelligence behind them. She wasn't just an animal, she was something far more dangerous. Her body was humanoid, but covered in that thick, pristine fur, her ears long and pointed, twitching. As she fought to stay conscious, a deep gash ran along her abdomen and smaller wounds dotted her arms and legs. It was clear she'd been in a fight, and judging by the state of her wounds, she'd barely survived it. Her tail, thick and fluffy, curled slightly around her own body as if to shield herself. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before his training kicked in. Whatever she was dying, and leaving her, there wasn't an option. He dropped to one knee, already digging through the medkit strapped to his belt. "All right, let's see what we've got here," he muttered. More to himself than to her. He wasn't sure if she could understand him, but he wasn't about to waste time figuring that out. Carefully, he pulled out a cauterizing gel and a sterile bandage, assessing the worst of her injuries. The moment he reached for her side, a deep rumbling growl vibrated through the cave. Low and warning, her sharp claws twitched, but she was too weak to lift them in any real threat. "Easy," Caleb murmured, meeting her glare with a steady gaze. "You're hurt, let me help, or you're not going to make it." Her chest rose and fell heavily, her nostrils flaring as she took in his scent. He had no idea what was going through her mind, but after a long, agonizing moment, the tension in her muscles eased, just barely, taking that as the closest thing to permission he was going to get. Caleb worked quickly. He cleaned the wounds, applied the gel, and wrapped the bandages as best he could with limited supplies. It wasn't perfect, but it would stop her from bleeding out. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels, exhaling sharply. He studied her for a moment, nodding the way her eyelids drooped, exhaustion clearly overtaking her. Whatever had attacked her had left her on the brink, and if he hadn't found her when he did, she likely wouldn't have made it through the night. As she drifted into unconsciousness, her breathing finally evening out, Caleb scanned the cave for anything useful. It wasn't much, but at least it was something: shelter from the storm outside, enough room to start a fire without suffocating, and now an unexpected companion. He didn't know what the hell he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was certain this planet wasn't done throwing surprises at him, yet hours passed, and the fire he'd managed to build crackled softly, filling the cave. With much-needed warmth, Calb leaned against the rock wall, exhaustion settling into his bones, but he refused to fully let his guard down. Every so often he'd glance at the alien woman curled on the opposite side of the fire, her breathing slow and steady, her fur rising and falling with each breath. Despite her injuries, she looked peaceful, her expression softened in sleep. He wasn't sure why, but he got the distinct feeling that she wasn't used to letting her guard down either. The quiet didn't last. A shift in the air was his only warning. Before she moved 1 second, she was still, and the next she was on him, fast. Despite her injuries, Calb barely had time to react before he found himself pinned beneath her, his back hitting the cold stone floor hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. He froze. Her face was inches from his, sapphire eyes burning with something primal. Her claws flexed against his shoulders, not quite digging in, but enough to remind him that if she wanted to rip him apart, she could. Her breathing was heavy, but there was no aggression in her posture, just something else entirely. "You touched me," she murmured, her voice rough from exhaustion, but there was something deeply possessive in it. Her tail curled around his leg, tightening. Calb swallowed hard, his brain struggling to keep up. "Yeah," he said cautiously, unsure where this was going. Her ears twitched, her gaze locking onto his like a predator assessing its claim. "Now," she said, her voice softer, but no less certain. "You are my mate." Calb stared up at the alien woman, pinning him down, his pulse hammering in his ears, his muscles tensed, ready to push her off if she tried anything. But despite her weight pressing against him, she didn't strike. She just held him, their eyes locked onto his, with an intensity that sent a different kind of warning through his brain. She was strong, even injured, but she wasn't attacking. No, this was something else. Entirely, something far more complicated. "You are my mate," she repeated, her voice low, steady, and completely convinced of what she was saying. Her thick tail curled tighter around his leg, the tip brushing against his knee, and he was suddenly painfully aware of how warm she was. The fire had already taken the edge off the cold, but her body heat radiated through the thin barrier of his clothes, making him acutely aware of the dangerous situation he was in, not because he thought she would hurt him, but because she seemed dead set on whatever alien logic had convinced her they were now bonded for life. Calb took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yeah, see, that's not how this works," he said, carefully choosing his words as if one wrong move would send her into a frenzy. "I patched you up. That doesn't mean you touched me," she cut in, her ears twitching at his defiance. "No one touches without intent. Well, I hate to break it to you, but I wasn't thinking about mating when I stopped you from bleeding out," he shot back, keeping his tone firm but not aggressive. He needed to make her understand, and fast. "I'm a medic helping injured people or aliens is what I do. It wasn't some kind of ritual. It wasn't a claim. It was just the right thing to do." She didn't move, her gaze never wavering. It wasn't that she didn't understand his words. He could tell she did. She just didn't care. "My kind do not owe debts," she murmured, as if explaining something that should be obvious. "You saved me, that makes you mine." Calb let his head fall back against the cold stone floor, exhaling sharply. Great. He wasn't just dealing with an injured alien werewolf. He was dealing with an injured alien werewolf who thought she'd just been handed a mate in the form of one very human, very confused man. "Look," he tried again, shifting slightly beneath her weight. "I appreciate the sentiment, but humans don't work like that. We don't just claim people over a first aid treatment." She blinked, tilting her head slightly, those piercing sapphire eyes studying him with sharp curiosity. "Then how do your kind claim mates?" Calb opened his mouth, then shut it again. That was a more complicated question than he was ready to deal with, explaining human relationships to a species that apparently bonded for life. On contact sounded like a nightmare waiting to happen. The last thing he needed was to accidentally give her the wrong impression and make things even worse. His silence must have been answer enough, because her grip on his shoulders loosened just slightly. She didn't let go but the rigid tension in her muscles eased, and after a long moment she let out a breath that sounded almost annoyed. "You do not wish to mate?" she asked bluntly, as if she were merely confirming facts. Calb dragged a hand down his face, resisting the urge to groan. "It's not about what I want, it's about choice. You don't just pick someone and decide they belong to you." Her tail flicked against his leg, and he swore he caught the faintest hint of amusement in her expression, like she found his resistance endearing. "You are." "Strange," she muttered, but there was no real bite to it. "And you're not." He shot back. "You pounced on me 5 minutes after waking up and declared, 'We're soulmates, that's a new one for me.'" She huffed, the warmth of her breath brushing against his face, before she finally lifted herself off him, though. She didn't move far. She settled back on her hunches, watching him with a level of possessiveness that still made him uneasy. Calb took the chance to sit up, rubbing at his sore shoulders. "All right," he said, forcing himself to focus. "First things first, what's your name?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question for the first time since waking up. She seemed almost hesitant, as if deciding how much to tell him. "Juno," she finally said. Calb nodded, tucking the name away. At least now he could call her something instead of just the terrifying werewolf woman who thinks I'm her mate. "Progress. All right, Juno," he said, keeping his voice even. "You're hurt. You lost a lot of blood. You need rest before you try claiming anyone." Juno narrowed her eyes slightly, as if trying to decide whether or not to challenge him on that. But then, with a sigh that sounded reluctant but resigned, she shifted, settling herself more comfortably by the fire. "You are stubborn," she muttered. Calb smirked. "You have no idea." The tension in the cave eased, if only slightly. He wasn't out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively, but at least for now he wasn't about to be tackled again. That was a win in his book. He let the silence settle, focusing on the fire, the warmth against his skin, a welcome relief from the bitter cold outside. June stayed close, watching him with that intense, unreadable gaze. It was going to be a long night. As the fire crackled softly between them, Calb realized something else. This was just the beginning. The fire crackled softly between them, filling the cave with much-needed warmth, but Calb was only half paying attention to the flickering embers. His focus remained locked on Juno, who, despite the injuries that should have kept her down, continued watching him like a predator, studying its prey. He had already patched her wounds, and she had finally stopped trying to pin him to the ground and declare him her mate, but the intensity in her gaze hadn't faded. If anything, it had only deepened, as if she were still trying to figure him out. That was fine. He was trying to figure her out too. Her fur gleamed in the fire, light, thick, and well adapted for the freezing hellscape outside. Every now and then her ears twitched at the wind howling beyond the cave's entrance, listening, assessing, always on alert. Her instincts must have been screaming at her that she was vulnerable in her condition, yet despite that she hadn't attacked him, she hadn't left either. That meant something, even if he wasn't sure what yet. Calb let out a slow breath, stretching out his sore muscles. His body was still aching from trudging through the snow all day, and the brief but aggressive misunderstanding with Juno hadn't helped. But now that the initial shock was over, a new problem was settling in. What the hell was he supposed to do next? He had no working ship, no way to contact his crew, and no clear plan beyond surviving long enough to come up with one. Juno complicated things, not just because she seemed to believe they were bonded, but because she was an unknown. He had no idea what her people were like, no idea if she had allies nearby, or if she was truly alone. If she had enemies, that was another issue entirely. The last thing he needed was to wake up to a pack of her kind. Deciding to finish what her wounds couldn't, he rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in. But before he could let his thoughts spiral too far, Juno shifted the movement, small but deliberate. "You are troubled," she observed, her voice steady, unbothered by the cold in a way that made him jealous. Calb glanced at her, debating whether or not to even bother answering, but the way she watched him, patient, expectant, made it clear she wouldn't let the silence stand. He sighed. "Yeah, well, being stranded On an ice planet without backup, tends to do that. Juno's tail flicked slightly her. Expression unreadable. You are strong, but alone that is unwise. Calb let out a dry chuckle. Tell me something I don't know. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow. My ship's wrecked. My supplies are low, and my best bet at survival is figuring out how to signal for help before I freeze to death out. Here Juno tilted her head, considering his words carefully after a long moment. She shifted her weight, her tail curling slightly around her own legs. You wish to leave? There was something in her tone, something he couldn't quite place. He glanced at her again, noticing the way her ears had flattened, just slightly, her expression more guarded than before. He sighed. Great, another landmine he had just stepped on without realizing. I didn't exactly come here by choice, he pointed out, keeping his tone even. My people are out there somewhere. I have to at least try to get back to them. Juno didn't respond right away, but the tension in her posture told him she didn't like his answer. He wasn't sure why that bothered her, but it did. After a long pause, she finally spoke again, her voice quieter this time. If you leave, would you return? Cal blinked, caught off guard by the question. There was something almost hesitant in the way she asked it, something that didn't match the fierce, battle-ready warrior she had been just hours ago. He wasn't sure how to answer, because the truth was he didn't know his priority was getting off this planet, beyond that he hadn't thought that far ahead before he could respond. June suddenly straightened, her ears snapping forward, her entire body going rigid. Cal immediately went on alert, recognizing the change in her posture for what it was. She had heard something. What is it? He asked, already reaching for his pulse pistol. Juno sniffed the air, her expression darkening. Something comes. Calb tensed, straining his ears, but all he could hear was the wind. That didn't mean she was wrong if her senses were sharper than his, which he guessed they were then. Whatever she had picked up on was already close. He cursed under his breath, shoving himself to his feet, eyes darting toward the cave entrance. He had no idea what kind of nightmare creatures called this planet home, but he really didn't want to find out the hard way. Juno stood as well, though her movements were slower, more deliberate. She was still recovering from her wounds, but even injured, she carried herself like a fighter preparing for battle. Her claws flexed slightly at her sides, and when she stepped toward the entrance, she moved like a shadow, silent despite her size. Calb followed, his pistol raised, his pulse picking up as he squinted into the swirling snow outside. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind, and then movement. A low, guttural snarl cut through the howling air, coming from somewhere just beyond the cave's entrance. Calb barely had time to register it before something massive lunged forward, crashing into the cave with enough force to send snow and ice raining down from the ceiling. Calb fired instinctively, but whatever this thing was, it was fast. His shot barely grazed its thick hide before it was on them. Snapping, powerful jaws, glowing yellow eyes locked onto its prey. It was big. Bigger than Juno, its body covered in thick, jagged fur that was asterisk matted with blood. Asterisk. Not its own. Juno didn't hesitate. She moved. In the blink of an eye, she was between Calb and the beast, her own snarl ripping through the cave as she met the attack. Head-on claws clashed, fur bristled, and the air filled with the sounds of a brutal struggle. Calb stumbled back, his heart hammering, but he didn't freeze. He leveled his pistol, waiting for a shot. Juno wasn't just fighting, she was winning. Despite her injuries, she was faster, her movements sharp, and calculated, every strike precise. The beast fought back, but it was clear it hadn't expected its prey to fight harder. With a final vicious strike, Juno's claws ripped through its throat, and it collapsed, twitching before finally going still. For a long moment, the only sound was their breathing, heavy and ragged. Juno's fur was slick with fresh blood, but none of it was hers. She turned to Calb's sapphire eyes still burning with adrenaline, but behind that, there was something else, something possessive. She took a step toward him, her tail flicking. You will not leave, she murmured low and certain. Caleb swallowed hard, his grip tightening on his pistol. He had a feeling that wasn't a question. Calb let out a slow breath, his fingers tight around his pulse pistol, As the weight of Juno's words settled over him, "You will not leave." It wasn't a question, wasn't even a demand, it was a simple, unalterable fact in her mind. He could see it in her posture, in the unwavering confidence of her stance. Despite the blood staining her fur from the fight, to her there was no discussion to be had. She had decided, and that was that. But Calb wasn't about to let someone else dictate his fate, no matter how impressive she was in battle. He had spent years clawing his way through the worst situations, fighting for control over his own life, and he sure as hell wasn't about to roll over and accept someone else's claim on him just because she'd killed a monster in front of him. He took a steadying breath, forcing his muscles to relax, then holstered his pistol in a slow, deliberate movement. He needed to handle this carefully. Pissing her off wouldn't end well, but neither would letting her believe he was something she could just keep. "I appreciate the backup," he said, keeping his voice measured as he gestured toward the carcass of the beast she had just torn apart. "Really, but I'm not staying here forever." Juno's ears twitched at his words, her tail flicking behind her in a slow, deliberate motion, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a step closer, and despite himself, Calb had to fight the urge to step back. She moved with purpose, eyes locked onto him, that same unreadable intensity burning in her sapphire gaze. She wasn't posturing for dominance, wasn't trying to intimidate him. She was assessing him, trying to understand, and that somehow was more unnerving than if she had just snarled at him outright. "You are strong," she finally said, voice even as if she were stating an observation rather than giving him a compliment. "But you are alone, without a pack, without allies. You are vulnerable." Her tail curled slightly as she studied him. "You should not wish to be alone," Calb huffed, shaking his head. "It's not about what I wish, it's about what's real. I've spent most of my life looking out for myself. I don't need a pack to survive." Juno tilted her head slightly, considering his words, then with a slow, deliberate movement, she crouched beside the fire, her body still tense, still on edge, but no longer in a stance of confrontation. She wasn't backing down, but she also wasn't pushing. "If that were true," she said softly, "you would have left me to die in the snow." Calb froze, his lips parting slightly before he could stop himself. He hadn't been expecting that. He clenched his jaw, looking away. "That was different, was it?" Juno's ears twitched. "You say you do not need others, but you still chose to save one. That is not something a lone hunter does." Calb exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He didn't want to argue about this. She was twisting his actions into something more than they were. He had saved her because she was injured, because he had been trained to help people in need, because leaving her out there to die hadn't sat right with him. That didn't mean he wanted to be part of a pack. He sighed. "Look, I helped you because it was the right thing to do. That doesn't mean I made it." June interrupted, her tail flicking. Calb gave her a tired glare. Yes, that she huffed a sound that was somewhere between annoyance and amusement, then leaned back on her hunches, finally breaking eye contact. He wasn't sure if she was accepting his argument or just waiting for him to get over it, but at least the immediate tension had eased. The fire crackled between them, and for a while neither of them spoke. Calb wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The silence was thick with unspoken weight, and though Juno no longer seemed like she was about to pounce on him and force him into some kind of alien, forever bond, she still watched him. He could feel it, the way her eyes traced his every movement, like she was committing everything about him to memory. After a long pause, she finally broke the silence. "You're kind," she said, tilting her head slightly. "How do they choose?" Calb frowned. "Choose?" She met his gaze. "Mates," he sighed. "It's complicated." Juno's ears twitched, and for the first time he caught a faint glimmer of frustration in her eyes. "Explain," she said, her tone bordering on demanding but not aggressive. She genuinely wanted to understand. Calb exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Where the hell did he even start?" "It's not like you're kind," he said finally. "We don't just pick someone and decide they belong to us. It takes time. We get to know each other. We choose to be together. It's not about instinct, it's about connection, trust." Juno frowned, slightly considering his words. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. "That is Not so different Caleb let out a tired laugh. I think it's pretty different, Juno. Didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out, picking up a piece of wood and turning it over in her claws, perhaps. She said, but I will not force you. That surprised him. He had expected more. Resistance, more insistence, but she said it so matter-of-factly, like it had been her decision all along, like she hadn't even considered the possibility that he had been in control of the situation at all. She met his gaze again. But you will stay, she added, her voice carrying a certainty that made it clear she wasn't looking for an argument. Caleb sighed, leaning back against the cave wall for now, he admitted. Juno's tail curled slightly, and though she didn't smile, he wasn't sure if her kind even could. There was something satisfied in her posture. The fire crackled, the storm howled outside, and for the first time since crash landing on this frozen hellscape, Caleb wasn't entirely sure he wanted to leave. Caleb had spent years in war zones, treating soldiers on the brink of death, patching up wounds in the middle of chaos, and keeping a level head even when everything was falling apart around him. But nothing, not the battlefields, not the near-death experiences, not the relentless survival instincts drilled into him, had prepared him for being trapped in a cave with a fiercely determined alien werewolf who had decided he wasn't just some passing stranger, but hers. He should have been trying harder to come up with an escape plan, should have been strategizing the best way to signal for help before he ran out of options. Instead, he sat by the fire, chewing on a strip of dried rations while June cleaned the blood from her claws with the sharp focus of a warrior who never let their guard down. She was injured, still recovering from whatever had nearly killed her before he found her, but she moved like someone who had no intention of resting. Every twitch of her ears, every flick of her tail was deliberate. Caleb had spent enough time around hardened fighters to recognize the signs. She wasn't just waiting to heal, she was waiting for something else. Finally, after too much silence, he sighed and set his food aside. So what happens now? He asked, rubbing a hand over face. Juno glanced at him, her piercing sapphire eyes assessing him the way a predator studied unfamiliar prey. You rest, recover your strength. Caleb let out a short laugh, shaking his head. That's not what I meant. He gestured vaguely toward the entrance of the cave, where the storm had settled into an eerie calm, the ice glittering under the pale light of the distant sun. What happens after this? Do you have a pack a home to go back to? Her ears twitched at the question, but for the first time since he had met her, there was a flicker of something else behind her steady gaze. Something unreadable. No, she said after a long pause. I have no pack. Caleb frowned. That wasn't the answer he had been expecting. Why not? Juno's claws flexed slightly before she curled them into a loose fist, as if suppressing an old instinct. I left, she said simply. They would not accept my choices. That answer didn't sit right with him. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. What choices? Juno hesitated, not because she was afraid to answer, but because she was choosing her words carefully. I refused a bond that made him pause. He knew enough about her species now to understand that bonds weren't casual things. If she had rejected one, it must have meant going against everything her people expected from her. Caleb exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. Let me guess, that didn't go over well. Juno huffed something that was almost a dry laugh. I was given a choice, accept or leave. I left. It was said so simply, as if it hadn't been a life-altering decision, as if walking away from everything she had ever known hadn't been something that should have destroyed her. But she had survived alone, and now here she was in this frozen wasteland telling her story as if it was nothing more than a fact of life. Caleb studied her carefully, a knot tightening in his chest. He had been alone before, too, had been forced to make choices that cost him everything he knew. What it was like to stand at a crossroads and realize that no matter what you did, you were going to lose something important. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then finally he let out a breath and shook his head. You and I have a lot more in common than I thought. Juno's ears perked slightly, her gaze sharp. You left something behind. Caleb scoffed, leaning back against the Cold stone wall more than one thing he didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Him instead she simply nodded, as if she understood without needing to ask the. Silence between them stretched again, but this time it wasn't tense, it wasn't the kind of silence that came from two strangers trying to figure each other out. It was something else, something. Comfortable Calb wasn't sure how long they sat there staring into the fire, the distant wind, whispering beyond the cave walls, but eventually Juno shifted her tail. Flicking lazily against the stone floor, "You still wish to leave," she said. Though this time it wasn't a challenge, it was an observation. Caleb exhaled. "I have to." "Try." Juno studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then I will take you to the wreckage." That caught him off guard. He had been expecting resistance, maybe even another declaration that he belonged to her now, whether he liked it or not, but instead she was offering to help. His surprise must have shown on his face, because Juno smirked sharp and knowing. "Do not mistake my willingness for surrender," she said, stretching out her legs. "I am merely ensuring my mate survives." Calb groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "For the last time, I know," she interrupted, waving a clawed hand dismissively. "Humans do not work like that." Caleb shot her a look. "Glad we're finally getting somewhere." Juno's smirk didn't fade. "But you will stay long enough to fix your ship." That at least was true. He couldn't leave until he had a way off this planet. Whether or not that would happen anytime soon was still up in the air. He sighed, rubbing the tension from his temples. "Fine. Tomorrow, we head for the wreckage." Juno nodded. Satisfied. "Rest? Then you will need your strength." Calb wanted to argue that he wasn't some helpless weakling who needed looking after, but honestly he was exhausted. His body, his mind was running in circles, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't alone. He leaned back, stretching his legs out toward the fire. Juno curled up beside it, her thick fur shifting as she settled in, her ears still twitching at every distant sound. She might have accepted that he planned to leave, but he could tell one thing hadn't changed. She was still watching him, still assessing him. And deep down, he had the unsettling feeling that no matter where this ended, no matter how long he stayed, or how far he went, she wasn't going to forget him. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to. Caleb woke to the soft crackling of dying embers and the heavy stillness of the cave. The fire had burned low, but it still radiated enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold at bay. He let out a slow breath, stretching out his sore muscles, feeling the stiffness that came from sleeping on solid rock. His body wasn't built for this kind of punishment, but he'd learned to deal with worse. What wasn't normal, however, was the soft weight draped partially over him, thick warm fur pressed against his side, a tail curled loosely around his leg. He glanced down and found Juno nestled close, her body half draped over his own, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her ears twitched slightly in sleep, but she didn't move away, and for a moment Calb just stared, unsure of what to do with this unexpected turn of events. This was different. Before, she had been possessive, insistent, making it clear that she had claimed him in some way that he didn't fully understand. But this wasn't a display of dominance, nor was it some alien instinct to mark territory. This was trust and unconscious comfort that made his throat tighten slightly, and that was dangerous. He exhaled slowly, careful not to wake her, as he eased himself into a sitting position. The last thing he needed was to let this situation get any more complicated than it already was. Juno had made her views on him clear, and while she had backed off on forcing the issue of their so-called bond, there was still an undeniable tension between them, one that wasn't entirely one-sided, if he was being honest with himself, but that didn't matter. What mattered was getting to his ship, salvaging what he could, and getting off this planet before he froze to death. Anything else, including the strange warmth in his chest when he looked at her, needed to be ignored. He shifted carefully, moving away from Juno's warmth and standing, stretching out the knots in his back. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving behind a landscape of untouched white, stretching endlessly beneath a pale alien sky. It was deceptively peaceful, but Calb knew better than to trust it. This planet had already thrown monsters at them once, and he had no doubt it would do so again. Behind him, Juno stirred her ears, flicking before her eyes opened sharp and alert despite her previous stillness. She took him in, her gaze flickering with something unreadable, and then without a word she stood stretching like a predator shaking off sleep. Her tail flicked behind her, and Calb had the distinct feeling that she knew exactly what he had been thinking and that she found it amusing. "We move," she said, simply rolling her shoulders, her body still recovering, but strong enough to fight if necessary. Calb nodded. "Yeah, the wreckage isn't far, but if anything survived the crash, we'll have to be careful." Juno made a low sound of agreement, then turned toward the cave entrance, stepping out into the snow. Without hesitation, Calb followed, bracing himself against the sudden chill, but at least the sky was clear. That was something. They moved in silence for a while, their footsteps crunching against the frozen ground. Calb's mind worked through possible outcomes. Best case, his emergency beacon was still functional, and he could send out a distress signal. Worst case, everything was totaled and he was stuck here indefinitely. Juno, on the other hand, moved with a different kind of focus. She was scanning the horizon, ears twitching at every distant sound, her body tense but controlled. She wasn't just walking, she was hunting, anticipating threats before they could appear. Calb found himself watching her more than he meant to. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered, not just in her physical form, but in everything else. She had the instincts of a predator, the strength of a warrior, but there was a quiet thoughtfulness beneath it all, something calculated, restrained. She wasn't just an animal following instinct, she was a survivor like him. They traveled for hours before the wreckage came into view, half buried in the snow, metal torn and scattered across the landscape. Calb let out a breath, picking up the pace, his heart hammering with cautious hope. He approached what was left of the cockpit, pushing aside broken panels, searching for the beacon. It had to be here. It had to still be. His fingers brushed against something intact beneath the wreckage, and his pulse jumped there. He yanked it free, a small, compact device, its outer casing cracked, but the internal components seemingly undamaged. He fumbled for the switch, his breath catching as he powered it on, only for the screen to flicker once before going dark. "No, no, no, come on," he muttered, shaking it slightly, pressing at the side panel, trying to coax life back into it. Juno watched him, her expression unreadable, but she didn't interfere. She just waited, letting him work. Calb ran through possible fixes in his head, but without power, without a way to reroute the signal. The beacon was just dead weight. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had one option left. He could try to salvage parts from the wreckage, rigged together something that might send out a distress call, but that would take time, and time was not on his side. Juno finally spoke. "Your machine is broken." Calb clenched his jaw, tossing the dead beacon aside. "Yeah, not completely, but enough that I can't use it yet." Juno studied him for a long moment, then with a slow, deliberate movement, she crouched beside him, resting one clawed hand against the cold metal. "Then we make it work." There was no hesitation in her words, no question of whether or not they should try. It was a statement, simple and unshakable. Calb exhaled, glancing at her. "You don't have to help me, you know." Juno's tail flicked her ears, tilting slightly. "You are my mate," he sighed. "Juno," she smirked just slightly, "and if my mate is to leave this place, he must be alive. That is what matters." Calb didn't know what to say to that. He didn't know how to respond to the unwavering certainty in her voice, so instead he nodded. "All right," he muttered, "let's get to work." Juno simply grinned, and for the first time, Calb wondered if maybe, just maybe, getting off this planet wouldn't be the end of their story. After all, Calb got to work digging through the wreckage for anything useful. The beacon was damaged, but not completely beyond repair. At least that's what he told himself as he pried open the casing and inspected the circuits. He had seen worse, had patched up things in conditions far more dire than this, but salvaging power from a dead ship in the middle of an icy wasteland was a challenge even for him. Juno crouched beside him, watching closely, her sharp eyes, following every movement of his hands. She had been quiet, not pressing him with unnecessary questions, but he could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she studied him, as if trying to commit his methods to memory. It was strange being observed so intently by someone who could just as easily rip apart her enemies with claws, instead of bothering with fragile human technology. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Your people rely on these machines for survival. Calb didn't look up. Yeah, we're not exactly built for places like this. He gestured vaguely toward the frozen wasteland stretching beyond the wreckage. We have to create tools to make up for what we lack. Juno huffed softly, as if the thought amused her. And yet you call us primitive? Calb smirked despite himself, shaking his head. I don't. Some humans might, but from where I'm standing, I'd say you have your own advantages. He glanced at her. You took down that thing in the cave with your bare hands. I needed a weapon just to have a chance against it. That's not primitive, that's efficient. Juno's ears twitched slightly, but she didn't reply right away. Instead, she leaned back on her hunches, considering his words. Strength alone does not always win, she admitted, surprising him. Cleverness, instincts, understanding of the hunt, these matter more. She looked at the beacon, tilting her head. This is your version of that, isn't it? Calb chuckled. Yeah, something like that. She nodded once, as if she approved of his answer, then settled into silence again, watching as he continued to work the circuits inside the beacon. Were mostly intact, but the power core was fried without a replacement. It wasn't going to send a signal strong enough to reach anyone. Calb cursed under his breath, leaning back on his heels. Juno picked up on his frustration. Immediately, it is broken, not completely, he muttered. The signal relay is fine, and I can reprogram the frequency, but it doesn't have enough power to transmit. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. I need an energy source, something small, stable, and capable of handling a long-range pulse. Juno was silent for a moment, then reached into the satchel strapped across her body. Calb hadn't paid much attention to it before. His focus had been on her, not her supplies, but now as she dug through it, his curiosity piqued. She pulled out something small and metallic, no bigger than his palm, and held it out to him. Calb took it carefully, frowning. As he turned it over in his hands, it was a power cell, sleek, compact, and completely alien in design. He ran his fingers over the surface, noting the faint pulse of energy beneath the casing. Where did you get this? He asked, looking up at her. Juno's expression didn't change. I took it. Calb narrowed his eyes. From who? Juno's tail flicked, and for the first time there was something guarded in her gaze. A traitor. He no longer needed it. There was something about the way she said it, calm, unbothered, as if she had simply taken what was necessary and moved on. Calb wasn't sure if that meant the traitor had been a willing participant, or if Juno had simply helped herself to the power cell after leaving a body behind. He decided not to ask. Instead, he focused on the device itself, turning it over his fingers. This might work, he admitted, carefully prying open the beacon's internal housing. It's not a perfect match, but if I can reroute the voltage and bypass the fail-safe, I can get it to charge the signal relay. Juno watched as he worked, her tail curling slightly as she observed. And this will call your people. Calb didn't look up. If it works, yeah. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer. And then you will leave. Calb paused, his hands stilling over the open beacon. He had been so focused on the task, so determined to fix the problem, that he hadn't really thought about what came next. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. That's the idea. Juno didn't say anything right away, but he could feel the shift in her posture. She wasn't angry, she wasn't even surprised, but there was something else there, something heavier, something unspoken. She had known from the beginning that this was temporary. He had made it clear from the start that his goal was to get back to his own kind. That this, whatever this was, wasn't permanent, and yet for the first time, Calb found himself wondering why the hell it suddenly felt like a mistake. The silence stretched between them, the only sound the soft hum of the power cell as it connected to the beacon's core. Finally, Juno let out a quiet breath, standing slowly, and stepping back from the wreckage. "I will hunt," she said simply. "You fix your machine." Calb frowned, but didn't stop her as she turned and disappeared into the snow. He watched her go, her form a blur of white against white, her movement silent despite her size. Something about the way she had left didn't sit right with him. He forced himself to focus, turning his attention back to the beacon. He had work to do, and if he got distracted now, he might lose his only chance at getting home. But even as he worked, even as he arrowed the circuits and adjusted the power flow, his mind kept circling back to the same thought for the first time since crashing here. He wasn't sure if leaving was what he wanted anymore. Calb worked in silence, forcing himself to focus on the beacon rather than the lingering weight of Juno's absence. The power cell she had given him was more advanced than he expected, but that only added another layer of unease to the situation. Juno was a survivor. That much was obvious, but her past, the things she wasn't saying, was starting to feel more important than he wanted to admit. He should have asked more questions, should have pressed harder about where she had come from, what she had done before she was injured. Instead, he had let himself get comfortable in the quiet truce they had settled into. His fingers worked quickly, stripping down wires, rerouting the power flow to compensate for the beacon's damaged systems. He had one shot at this. The storm had passed, and if he could get the signal out, there was a chance, a slim one, but a chance that his crew or someone in the sector would pick it up. If not, he was back to square one, stranded with limited supplies and no real hope of escape. Juno had said nothing when she left, just a simple statement that she would hunt, and then she was gone, slipping into the frozen landscape. As if she were part of it, he had let her go without argument, but now with the weight of her absence pressing down on him, he realized just how much he had gotten used to her being there. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before flicking the power switch on the beacon. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft hum vibrated through the device, the screen flickering to life, faint but readable. Calb exhaled, his pulse picking up. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but this was progress. He adjusted the frequency, fingers moving with trained precision as he set the distress call to broadcast on an emergency loop. Then he waited. The cold crept in around him, the fire inside the wreckage flickering lower as the wind outside began to pick up again. He checked his weapons, counted his remaining rations, did everything he could not to think about what would happen if no one responded. Time stretched, the beacon transmitted, no answer came. His jaw clenched. He adjusted the settings again, boosting the signal as much as he dared without risking a burnout. Still nothing. He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping in. He had done everything right. The beacon was functioning, the signal was broadcasting. There should have been a noise. Calb stiffened, every muscle tensing as his hand went to his pistol. At first it was just the wind howling through the wreckage, a natural sound he had grown accustomed to, but then underneath it something else, a low, deliberate growl, distant, but getting closer. He stood slowly, scanning the area. His gut told him he wasn't alone anymore. Then he saw them, shapes moving through the snow, dark figures cutting through the blinding white, their forms large and fast. There were three, maybe four, too many to be wild predators, too organized in the way they moved, the way they surrounded the wreckage. Instead of attacking outright Juno's kind, the realization hit him hard, but there was no time to think about what it meant. They were hunting him, and if Juno had left to hunt as well, had she known they were coming, his grip tightened on his pistol. He wasn't stupid. He knew a fight against an entire pack wasn't one he could win. If they wanted to kill him, they would, but they weren't attacking yet, which meant they wanted something else. Then one of them stepped forward, tall and broad, fur a darker shade than Juno's, his piercing amber eyes locking onto Calb like a predator, studying prey. "That wasn't running human," the alien said, his voice deep, measured. "You are far from home." Calb did lower his weapon. "Yeah, well, I didn't exactly plan for this trip." The alien bared his teeth slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a threat. "You are with The exile Calb's stomach tightened. Juno, he kept his expression unreadable. If you mean the one who saved my ass, then, yeah, I guess I am. The alien's eyes flickered. With something unreadable, she does not belong to you. Calb exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. She doesn't belong to anyone. The pack members shifted slightly, their movements restless, but none of them stepped forward. Calb had seen pack behavior before. They were testing him, seeing if he would break, if he would run, if he was weak. He didn't move. The leader studied him for a long moment, then spoke again. Voice quieter this time. Juno is ours. Something cold settled in Calb's chest. She doesn't seem to think so, he said evenly. The alien's ears flicked back, his tail curling slightly behind him. She was given a choice. She made the wrong one. Calb's grip on his pistol tightened, but he didn't raise it. He needed answers before this turned into a bloodbath. What do you want with her? The alien stepped closer, unbothered by the weapon still in Calb's hand. She has what is ours. We have come to take it back. Calb's stomach turned. He wasn't an idiot. He knew what they were saying. They weren't here for a stolen object. They were here for her. A sharp movement in the snow caught his eye, and before he could react, Juno was there, stepping into the clearing like a ghost from the storm. Her fur was damp with melting frost, her breath coming in slow, measured exhales. She hadn't run, she hadn't hidden. She had known they were coming, and she had come back anyway. The pack shifted, muscles tensing, tails flicking, but they did not attack, not yet. Juno's gaze landed on Calb, and for the first time since he had met her, there was something like regret in her expression. She turned to the pack leader, standing tall despite her wounds. You should not have come. The leader's expression darkened. You know why we are here? Juno's claws flexed at her sides. I do. Calb's chest tightened. She was going to fight. The leader bared his teeth. Then you know how this ends. Juno didn't blink, not like last time. The storm raged in the distance. The beacon pulsed behind him, and Calb knew without a doubt whatever happened next, nothing would be the same. Calb's grip on his pistol didn't loosen, but he knew damn well that shooting wasn't the answer here. Not yet. The pack had numbers on their side, and even though Juno was a beast in battle, she was still recovering. If they fought now, they wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. He had seen too many fights spiral into chaos when people made the wrong move, when pride and anger took over before strategy. This wasn't about winning a battle, it was about surviving the aftermath. Juno stood firm, her tail flicking once behind her, the only outward sign of agitation. She allowed herself. The leader of the pack, her former pack, if he had to guess, watched her with the cold patience of someone who knew he held the advantage. Calb recognized that look. He had seen it before in war zones, in desperate negotiations, where one side had the upper hand and the other side was fighting to keep from losing everything. You broke the bond, the leader said, his voice even controlled. You abandoned your place among us. His sharp amber eyes flickered toward Calb, assessing him like an inconvenience rather than a threat. And now you protect this human. The way he said it wasn't even mocking, just disdainful, like Calb wasn't worth acknowledging beyond the trouble he caused. Juno's muscles tensed, but she didn't take the bait. I made my choice, she said, her tone sharp. I do not regret it. The leader took a slow step forward, and instinctively, Calb mirrored the movement, placing himself just slightly in front of Juno. He didn't touch her. He knew that would only make things worse, but he made damn sure the pack saw what he was doing. He wasn't stepping aside. The leader noticed his eyes flickered with something. Calb couldn't quite place: amusement, curiosity, disbelief. But he didn't comment on it. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. And yet here you stand. Juno's jaw clenched. I will not go back. The pack shifted, some of them bristling, the tension rising like an impending storm. Calb wasn't sure if they were here to drag her back or put her down, and he wasn't sure which was worse. She is no longer one of us. Another voice growled, one of the packmates standing just behind the leader. His fur was darker than the others, his stance rigid, barely keeping his temper in check. She has no claim to our protection. Juno's ears flicked toward him, but her expression remained unreadable. I never asked for it. Calb's Patience was wearing thin. He didn't understand the full scope of whatever the hell was happening here, but he knew. One thing for sure, he wasn't letting them take her. He exhaled sharply, finally breaking his silence. If she's no longer one of you, then why are you here? His voice was calm. Steady but deliberate. Seems to me like you don't get to pick and choose when she matters to your little pack. The second packmate snarled, stepping forward, but the leader lifted a hand, stopping him. His amber eyes locked onto Calb, and for the first time there was something calculating behind them. You do not understand our ways, the leader said simply. She belongs with us whether she wishes to or not. Calb's jaw tightened. She already made her decision. The leader studied him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. And you believe this is your decision to make as well? Calb didn't hesitate. Yeah. Juno glanced at him. Then just briefly, her expression unreadable. The leader tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp. And if we take her? Calb let out a humorless laugh. You can try. The second packmate snarled again, stepping forward, his claws flexing, but the leader didn't stop him this time. Calb knew this was it. The line had been crossed, and there was no coming back from it. Juno moved first. She didn't hesitate, didn't wait for an opening. She was the opening. Her claws slashed through the intercepting the attacking Pachem. The impact sent them both crashing into the snow, a violent tangle of snarls and flashing fangs. The leader didn't flinch. He had expected this. He didn't even glance at the fight, his focus remaining on Calb instead. You fight for her, he said almost to himself. Calb leveled his pistol at him. Damn right I do. The leader exhaled, and then to Calb's surprise, he took a step back, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but out of something else entirely. You are willing to challenge our claim, the leader said, his tone still unreadable. That makes you one of two things, human, a fool, or something else. Calb kept his pistol raised. Try me. The leader's lips curled slightly, something like a smirk forming at the edges. Not today. He turned his head slightly, calling out to his pack. Enough. Juno was mid-strike, pinning her opponent down, her claws poised to end it, but at the leader's command, she hesitated just barely, but enough for her opponent to scramble away, panting, snarling, but not attacking again. Calb kept his pistol raised, unsure if this was a trick. Just like that, the leader's gaze was steady. Juno made her choice once. I wanted to see if she would make it again. He glanced at her, then his eyes darkening. She has Juno's breathing was heavy, her fur bristling, but she didn't lower her stance until the leader took a deliberate step away from them. This is not over, the leader said, but there was no anger in it, just certainty. We will not come for her again, but she is no longer of us. She will not find safety should she cross our territory again. Juno didn't flinch. I never needed it. The leader held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once before turning away. His pack followed, though the second one, the one Juno had nearly torn apart, shot Calb a look of pure hatred before disappearing into the snow. And just like that, they were gone. Calb lowered his pistol, exhaling slowly. Juno didn't move, her breathing still heavy, her hands clenched into fists. She had won, but something about it felt hollow. Finally, after a long silence, Calb spoke. You okay? Juno let out a slow breath, then turned to him. I am free. There was something raw in her voice, something neither triumphant nor regretful, just true. Calb nodded. Good. The wind howled in the distance. The beacon still pulsed behind them, and for the first time since this all started, Calb knew exactly what his next move was. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, but for the first time since crashing on this planet, Calb didn't feel the cold pressing into his bones. The pack was gone. Juno was free. The battle was over. But the weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the air. He had fought for her not because she had asked him to, not because he had some obligation to, but because he wanted to, and that realization settled deep inside him as undeniable as the pulse of his own heartbeat. Juno stood beside him, silent but tense, her breathing slowing from the fight, her body still coiled like she expected another battle to come. But there wouldn't be one, not today. She had won, and now she was left standing in the aftermath in a world where she no longer had a pack to return to, no place, waiting for her the thought should have been terrifying, but when she turned to Calb, there was no fear in her gaze, there was something else, something steady. Something certain. You are still here, she murmured, her voice low but carrying. Over the wind, Calb let out a breath, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, where else would I be? Juno studied him for a long moment before huffing softly, shaking her head. You have what you need, your beacon, your signal. Soon your people will come. He knew what she was doing, pushing him away. Before he could make the choice himself, he had seen it before. The way people tried to detach themselves from something before it could be taken from them. She expected him to leave. She expected him to walk away, because that's what humans did, that's what everyone did. Calb crossed his arms, looking at her with an expression that made it clear he wasn't about to let her take the easy way out. Yeah, the beacon's working, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to vanish the second a ship shows up. Juno's ears twitched, but she didn't look away. You are not bound to me. Calb let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You keep saying that like I ever needed to be. He took a step toward her, his voice lowering slightly. I didn't fight for you because I had to. I didn't stand with you because of some instinct or some claim you made when you woke up in that cave. He exhaled, holding her gaze. I did it because I wanted to. Juno's tail flicked, and for the first time, something uncertain crossed her expression, like she didn't know how to respond to that. Calb could see the way her muscles tensed, like she was preparing for some inevitable rejection that wasn't coming. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't know what happens next. Maybe my people come, maybe they don't. But what I do know is that I'm not going anywhere until we figure that out. Together, Juno narrowed her eyes. Slightly. You would stay? Calb snorted. I've been stuck here this long. What's a little longer? She blinked at him, then huffed, shaking her head in what could only be amusement. You are stubborn, he smirked. So are you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the silence between them, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Calb had never been one for grand gestures or poetic confessions, but standing here in this desolate, frozen world, he realized that whatever had built between them over these past days was real. It wasn't about survival anymore. It wasn't about obligation. It was about choice. Juno's ears flicked forward, her sharp sapphire eyes studying him with something deeper, something she had kept guarded for too long. You're kind. You choose your mates, she murmured, voice quieter now. Calb swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Yeah. Juno took a step closer, her presence warm despite the cold. Then I ask you now, human. Her voice was steady, but there was something behind it. Hope. Do you choose me? Calb didn't hesitate. Yes. Juno exhaled softly, and then asterisk, before he could process it, asterisk, risk. She was closing the distance between them, pressing against him, her warmth seeping through the layers of his clothes. Her head dipped slightly, her nose brushing against his neck, an action that felt both instinctual and deliberate, as if this was something her kind did. When words weren't enough, Calb stiffened for half a second before relaxing into her, his arms wrapping around her. Without thought, she was solid, warm, real. He hadn't realized how much he had needed this, not just her, but the understanding that he wasn't alone anymore. She rumbled deep in her chest, something almost pleased, and Calb chuckled against her fur. You still think I'm fragile? June huffed. You are. He rolled his eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. Sure, whatever you say. They stayed like that for a long moment, the storm fatting around them, the weight of everything settling in, but for once it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a beginning instead of an end. Eventually, Juno pulled back, her gaze steady, her tail curling slightly around his leg again, but this time he didn't pull away from it. You will not regret this, she murmured. Caleb smirked. I know. The beacon pulsed behind them, still sending its signal. Maybe a ship would come, maybe they'd leave this planet together, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd stay, build something here, make their own way. It didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, Calb wasn't just surviving, he was choosing to live, and he wasn't doing it alone.